On this edition of Pipeline Things, we bring on long overdue guest Tom Bubenik to talk about his paper on ILI performance according to 1163. And I'm just going to ask the question to the audience on why you should listen to this episode. If I asked you how many inspections do you think can be qualified to API 1163 in the vendor's reported specification for tolerances, what would your answer be? 50%? 10%? 70%? 100%? You need to listen to this episode.
You didn't offer a confidence interval.
You need to listen to this episode to find the answer to that question and some discussion on confidence intervals. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the PPIM edition of Pipeline Things. We are looking at another great guest from our 2025 paper selection, and that is going to be Tom Bubenik. Now, I have to say, without question, we have a decent listener base, Tom, and they give us feedback on topics they want us to cover. Guests, you are the most requested guest.
Yeah,
thank you.
And I mean,
I don't believe it, but thank you.
I'm telling you, after the Sage series, we got a rift of emails. Why wasn't Tom on this? Why wasn't Tom here?
If it's a Sage series, why was Tom not on it? How did you miss that? Why did you do this?
Series?
Do you have a problem with Tom?
No. You guys must have a problem.
He just ghosted me.
Let's talk
he just ghosted me. Now I know what it feels like.
So I'm actually, Tom, personally, I mean, you're one of those people in the industry, like I told Mike Rosenfeld, whose reputation just really precedes him. You're very revered. Like, people have an immense amount of respect.
Yeah.
You're where I hope to be whenever I reach the end of my career.
Good.
I want you to know, like, that's how people look up to you. So it's really an honor to have you on the show.
I appreciate that.
So, but we didn't bring you here just to talk about it. See, people are stopping to take photos of
It's
you now.
you, Tom.
Wow, that makes me feel good.
I mean, yes. So, and I don't know who that was, so I assume they took the photo for you.
I have no idea.
There you go. So, your paper was lessons learned using API 1163 for metal loss.
Right.
And this is I'm going to say, the trouble I'm going to have managing this episode is 1163 is like Chris's baby. He's really passionate about it, and you have a lot to say about it. I think it's going to be a great episode. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of leeway. Give me the background. What drove you to write this paper and look at 1163? Because we've had it for a while now.
That's right. So I've been involved with 1163. The first edition I helped write, and I helped edit the third edition.
Yeah.
Okay. The first edition was directed a lot by the inspection companies with less input from the pipeline companies. That's because it was on their vested interest to have a document like this. Second edition came along. There were some changes and improvements. By the time we got to the third edition, we wanted to see if we could strengthen it a little bit, change a few things that were optional in the second edition and make them mandatory in the third edition. And the idea was to bring along more consistency in industry. We wanted to be able to make sure that when somebody ran an inline inspection, they could use 1163 to validate the inspection, and on that basis, make a good decision about maintaining the integrity of their system.
Okay. I'm sorry. I have to ask a question out of ignorance. You mentioned 3 editions of 1163. Is the third edition the one that's incorporated by reference?
No. The second edition
The
is.
second edition is the one that's incorporated by reference. But today we're talking about the third edition.
Yes, we are.
Yep. Okay. So given that's the third edition, what did you do? What was the purpose of the paper? What were you investigating?
Okay. So I was involved in helping write the section of the paper the section of the 1163 that the paper discusses. And that's the validation section. All right. It talks about how do you demonstrate that the inline inspection met its performance spec. It did what you expected it to do. And I was curious as to how it worked out. How would it work out when pipeline companies came about and tried to do this? Would it give good results? Would it make them do more digs than they're used to doing? Would it make them change their integrity management decisions? That's what I wanted to know. And that's why we did the paper.
And so just to elaborate on that for users that are out there, when you qualify an ILI tool, it has a performance specification. We do FFS, or burst pressures, on the basis of that performance specification. Right. If the tool meets that performance specification, the tolerances you added, and hence you have a lot of confidence in your assessment. If it doesn't, then potentially that raises questions about whether you added sufficient tolerance to your assessment. So this has significant implications when you say whether or not a tool met its stated performance specification. Okay.
A lot of pipeline companies will take that tolerance number and say add it to the reported depths. It gives them a conservative idea of what that defect might look like and a conservative burst pressure approximation.
Got you. And so you did this study using a data set of reported pipeline features and provided excavation results.
Absolutely.
How many studies? So give me the details of the study.
Okay.
What are we talking about here?
So we looked at 100 cases. We looked at 100 pipelines where pipeline companies had contracted with an inspection company, performed an inspection, and afterwards went out and had done digs. And then in those digs, they measured the depths of the anomalies, and they compared them to what the reported depth was from the ILI. And the results were surprising.
What do you mean by surprising?
Well, the results showed me that things were more conservative than I expected. And by conservative here, I mean they were saying that the tolerances that are being applied on an inline inspection are bigger than what the inline inspection companies were saying they are.
Tolerances that were applied were larger than what the inline inspection company was saying they were.
Basically, that means the inline inspection companies were a little bit optimistic in terms of how that tool would perform. So that's a big implication in terms of things like dig and repair. If, in fact, the tool is performing, say, plus or minus 15% versus plus or minus 10%, it's not as accurate.
Right.
If you take that inaccuracy into account, you have to dig more. If you have to dig more, you have to take more measurements, you have to spend more money. And is it providing any benefit at the end of the day in terms of safety?
So I want to make sure that I understand this because now I'm curious about the actual data set. So each pipeline you would go through, you would take a look at the reported features and the reported excavations. But some of these runs you mentioned were like past 10 years.
Yeah.
So the operator at that time chose some number of excavations based on I'm not sure what.
Based upon their normal procedure.
Yeah.
And then you determine whether or not the tool met its performance specification based on the digs that you were provided.
Correct. And based on the third edition of API 1163.
All right.
Now, did you group all these? You looked at them individually?
I looked at them individually.
Okay. And so what's curious to me about this, though, is can't you, if you're not within your performance specification, for instance, do additional digs?
You can. In
So-
fact, that's one of the findings of the study. A number of the dig programs that the operators didn't have enough data points to do a correct statistical validation of results. So we had to look at that, and in those cases, either the operator would have to do more digs, take more measurements, or it can revert to something called a level 1 analysis if the defects are shallow or if he has a great deal of experience with the inspection system being done.
Yeah, if I can, maybe let's back up just a wee bit if you don't mind. We briefly talked about, and let's keep it in context of the paper, there were more shalls statements is the way I'll say it. There's more requirements in level 3 that were
Absolutely.
before were optional
in the
level
third
2.
edition.
Yeah.
There are more shall statements than should statements
Were any
in the
of
second
those
edition.
making it harder to meet the requirements of 1163? Were any of those that we would say are a little bit game changers or elevate the standard that's needed to say it achieves performance or achieves success?
Okay. It made it harder to be able to say that my inspection met its performance specification.
And how did it do that?
Okay. It did it in a couple of different ways. The statistical techniques that are present, they basically allow you to test the actual performance of the tool. Okay? You look at the results and you say, hey, I expected to find, let's say, 8 out of 10 within specification. 8 out of 10 of my measurements should be within plus or minus 10%.
Yeah.
Well, the statistical methods allow you to try to determine, is that met? In fact, did I meet that? And what we found was, again, some of the programs didn't have enough dig measurements to be able to do any kind of evaluation. Some of them had enough, but the evaluation said, no, it did not meet its performance spec. When it says, no, it could not meet its performance spec, API 1163 says, you should reject that inspection. Well, that's not the right answer, because a lot of times it was close to meeting, And by using a little bit larger specification, you could use that information.
For example,
and
plus or minus
accept-
14% instead of plus or minus 10%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Man, this is such great work, Tom.
Yeah.
I have questions I want to ask because now I feel like I'm really getting onto this. On average, you did 100. How many excavations just on average per run do you think you had?
Let's see. We had about 14,000 digs. Okay.
Yeah.
So out of 100, so that meant on average we had about 140. That's a big number.
That is a big number per inspection. I would not expect most
Yeah.
operators to do 140
Well,
excavations.
And it was
Keep in
digs or
mind-
joints or anomalies.
but
It's
each dig
measurement.
could do it's a
Yeah.
If you
measurement,
did a
yes.
laser map, for example, you might have hundreds or thousands of measurements
Comparison
on a
points.
single joint of pipe.
Got you. Okay. That makes a lot more sense. And so out of the 100 studies you did now, and 100's nice because it allows us to speak.
Yeah.
How many were outright rejected?
Well,
We
About-
should define rejected. Rejected means...
let's define
Yeah,
reject.
define rejected. I shouldn't define it. You wrote the paper.
Okay.
Define rejected for me.
Well, there are several ways in which you can reject an inspection in 1163. One is if you don't have enough measurement points. Okay.
So level 3 now says you have to have a minimum number of features. Because
For
before
a
we've
level
all
2 or a level 3 evaluation, you have to have a minimum number of measurements. And that number for a level 2 is 6. The number for a level 3 is 10. So some of the inspections had less than that. And basically what would happen is you'd be sent back to the schoolroom to get more data and more information so that you could run the
But
evaluation.
that's not a fault of the ILI
but,
vendor.
yeah, but I'm
That's-
gonna
not
get some
the
low
fault.
hanging
That's
fruit
on the
here,
operator.
and you don't care if it's in the same joint as long as it's unique features.
Unique features.
Gotcha.
Right.
Got it.
That's at least 10
Yep.
measurements. So how many out of the 100 approximately didn't meet the minimum threshold for measurements to validate the tool? Which again is nothing to do with the ILI vendor. They can't control that.
In our case, it was 13, so a little
13.
under 15%.
It's not too bad.
So basically 1 in 6 or 7
Okay.
didn't meet the specification.
All right. And then our second group, or what I'm calling the second group now,
Yeah.
maybe you call it a different thing. How many would have resulted in qualifying a larger tolerance than what was in the ILI vendor specification?
I'm going to say the numbers are probably about 60 to 65%. It's a huge number.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
It's a big number.
2/3 of the I want to state this and correct me if I'm wrong. I want to make sure I'm not misstating this. 2/3 of the inspections that you looked at could not have justified using the ILI vendor specification,
Stated performance spec.
stated performance specification, and instead would have needed to use something larger to
Larger to
statistically
make it.
justify their fitness for service.
And I'll use another
Absolutely.
word, and I'll qualify that statement by saying, and these were all within the essential variables of the system. We're assuming
Yes.
that these were all
Yes.
within like normal wall thickness range,
Yes.
DQAs were reviewed and all. So we're going to put that aside and say
Okay.
it wasn't a essential variable situation.
Agreed.
So out of this 2/3, I don't know if you can opine on this. What are there any portion of those that maybe if they'd done additional measurements could have benefited,
Yep.
maybe gotten to that ILI
Yes.
tolerance?
We looked at that, and a handful, meaning maybe 10, 15 of them, could have used more measurements and may have passed the performance, the API 1163 validation with more measurements.
That still leaves half, though. I mean,
It
that's
still leaves a lot.
telling you half did not meet the performance spec.
Mhm. It gets a little worse than that.
Oh,
It turns
God,
out
are
that
you getting
40, 40 out of 100, the API validation actually said it did not meet its spec, period. And in API 1163, when you have this outcome, it's called outcome 1 in the document. If you have outcome 1, you're supposed to reject the inspection. Not a good idea.
It's an expensive idea.
It's an expensive idea. And what makes a lot more sense is to look at whether you would have passed the validation using a bigger tolerance. And that's what we
so there's
demonstrate.
not a loop that's in there. There's not a loop that
Currently,
says, go back
there's
and
not a loop that says-
reevaluate for a larger
Yeah.
tolerance.
That's right. That's what it needs to have in it in the next edition of 1163 is a way to go back and say, okay, I didn't pass it plus or minus 10%. What happens if I use 11% or 15% or 20%?
So let's-
Can I pass?
Tom, let's go through a scenario here because I like where you're going with this, and I always like to try to make it practical. Rhett calls it. I say so what? Like what's the so what of this?
Absolutely.
So let's say we're dealing with second edition,
Mhm.
and we don't have a defined minimum number of samples needed to do a
Right.
level 2 or level 3. is there a scenario that you would buy off on as this? Operator says, I have 10 samples,
Right?
and it's at plus or minus 14%. Can I not say that that is a level 3 where the spirit of the level 3 is to define its performance, and then you use that performance in your integrity assessment?
Right now, API 1163 doesn't have a way to say to do that. There are some things that are in there that allow you to use larger tolerances. For example, if you do a level 2 validation, level 2 provides what's called an equivalent tolerance. But those equivalent tolerances are sometimes pretty large.
Yep.
All right. They're not as, they're bigger than what you would do if you just increase the tolerance to see what would cause it to pass.
Sure.
So before we take a break, I want to wrap up the results of the
Sure.
study. So I just want to reiterate it. We had about, let's just say 15% outright failed. Or no, didn't take enough data points.
Yep.
About 15% didn't take enough data points. About 10%, they didn't meet the specification, but had they taken more measurements, potentially could have met the specification. 50% outright failed for the specification. And then I assume that leaves about another 10 or 15% that passed.
Yeah,
That would have gotten
it's in that
passing
vicinity.
marks.
20-25% would have passed.
I know what I'm asking.
I
When we come back, I know what I'm
I
asking.
know. I just want the audience to chew on that because I do understand why you're surprised now. That does not sound like, does not sound pleasant. That does not
Yeah.
sound good. And I'm going to be honest. In the plenary, there was another paper that took a look at ILI performance over the
Right.
last 10 years and presented thousands of data points. And I think, again, that was Sherry Baucom's paper. She didn't endeavor to drive that point home, but she did present a similar picture with, I think, wider data than many of us may be aware of in
Okay.
our excavation.
So the question I want to ask when we come back is
Why don't you take us to the
why,
break, Christopher?
why would you say so? You know, why do we think that is? Why do we think that 2/3 of the data sets are not meeting their performance spec?
So when we come back, we're going to hear Tom's thoughts on why do we think that. Stay tuned and we'll be right back when you join us. All right, welcome back as we continue our conversation with Tom Bubenik. Extremely excited to be here with you. So we set the stage in the first part of the episode. I'm just going to recap it real quick. Tom looked at the performance, real-world performance of API 1163 using approximately 100 inspections. And using the data from those inspections, we found that about 10% of those inspections had insufficient data points to use or to assess it at all. We found that about 15% of the inspections couldn't meet the stated performance specification of the tool, but had they taken additional measurements, potentially could have gotten over the hump. About 50%, no matter what, could meet the stated performance specification. And we discussed the fact that there's a missing loop in 1163 right now that allows them to go and evaluate for a larger specification. And
That's
then
right.
finally, there's 10 to 15%, and I did not verify during the break whether this adds up to 100. Somebody, I'm sure, will leave a comment on the podcast that it doesn't, but about 10 to 15% passed and got an A in the course. Right.
A little bit less than that, but
And I had a
5%.
question.
And then Chris asked a question.
Why do you think it was that? I remember 2/3. Why is it that you think that about 2/3 of them were not able to achieve their specification? Did you guys have any? Did you rationalize it at all? Do you have any ideas
Or
as
I
to
think
why?
you asked a different. Why is it surprising to
Yeah.
us?
Well,
Why
for
is
me,
it
it's more.
surprising?
No, for me, it's why do you think that may happen? Like, what do you think the reason for it is?
Okay.
That they're not able to achieve their spec.
I think that in general, when we think about ILI performance specifications, they're made under generally idealized conditions. All right? They're what the tool will do on a good day. It's what the tool will do when the sun is bright and it's not raining in the ditch and all of those sort of things. And so instead what we have is we have the real world. And in the real world, things are not quite as good as what we would hope them to be.
Wait, so when we look at the pull
Oh,
test
boy.
spools that are real nice, circular type features at various depths at really cool patterns, you're saying
Oh,
that's
boy.
not how corrosion
That's not
looks
how
like
the
in the
real
real
corrosion
world?
world looks.
Oh, boy.
my God.
And as a result, the performance specs tend to be optimistic, maybe a lot optimistic. Depends upon the inspection technology.
That's so subtle. You hear we did that?
But see, I was thinking that it's surprising to me because I do still feel like we've done a good job of keeping our pipeline safe. And I guess the reality
too.
of
We
that,
have.
The reality is that fortunately stress engineering used to tell me, fortunately steel is ductile.
Mhm.
And we use appropriate safety factors.
Right.
So,
Well, yeah. I mean, that's why we like modified B31, right? Because again, as long as you get the depth close enough, you're digging the right stuff. And let's not get on the R string conversation, but
Okay.
we get the point.
No, let's not. So, Tom, I want to play devil's advocate a bit now, right? Because you presented. So I want to play the opposite side, and I want to challenge your findings a bit.
Go ahead.
So the first thing, go ahead. You will lose, but you can challenge it. You're a consultant, and as a consultant, we normally get the problems that are the tougher, the more difficult, the challenging. In the 100 data sets, which I'm assuming you randomly selected within D&V's database, is it possible that you have some form of selection bias there, or that you only seeing the bad children and you're not seeing because I would assume somebody came to you and gave you that data set because they had problems potentially. Do you think any of that could potentially be at play here, such that maybe your dark world picture is a little rosier?
I think that's probably possible. The 100 cases come from a large variety of different pipeline operators. So it's not all from the same company.
How did you go about selecting them? Did you randomly do it?
We actually looked at ones that we had analyzed, as you mentioned, for other purposes.
It's just a machine learning and a neural network.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God.
I love machine learning. I love statistics. I love all of that sort of stuff.
So is it, you think that it's unlikely that played a role?
Well, I think it could have impacted what we're doing. It could have made things look a little bit worse than they really are. But the fact is, if 50% or more don't pass the validation, that's a big number. It's a big number, whether it's 50% or 40% or 60%.
I would say it is a big number. I agree. I think if there's one thing that strikes me from this episode, it's that number, because I don't think anybody would have guessed 50%. And if I'm real curious what our listeners' reactions are to that number. But it really begs the question for me. I mean, I like to do a lot of studies like this myself, Tom, really looking at how good are we at doing something, whatever that is, whether it's bending strain, whether it's dense. That's why I did repeatability studies on dense. How well do we do this? Where do we go from here, though? I mean, I feel like you picked a scab, or you turned over a rock now, and now we can't put that rock back down. Okay. So what should we do next?
I think there's a couple of things that need to be done.
More people taking photos of you. We don't have this many people take photos of us, Tom. I'm just telling you, you're kind of a big deal.
I told you I wanted him to come on the Sage series.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Where do we go
from
here?
There's a couple of things, a couple of places that we can go. One is, I think pipeline operators need to be prepared for this. All right? If PHMSA decides to incorporate by reference the third edition of API 1163, companies are going to be required to face these problems themselves. And they're going to have a way to realistically estimate what the tolerances are. All right? If we fail at plus or minus 10%, we might pass at plus or minus 11 or 12 or 20%. So step number one is be prepared. Step number two, I think, is to recognize that the tolerances that you will be using in your integrity decisions may be larger than what you've historically used. In other words, if you're used to adding 10% to the reported depths in order to look at what might be a problem in the future, maybe you have to add plus or minus 15 or plus or minus a different number.
Yeah, and let's get there, though, Tom, right? I mean, let's have a brief discussion on that. Am I wrong from your perspective in saying this? It's that, one, that's ILI system dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I'm keeping a database to understand the performance of the tools I've been using, whether I as an operator do that or I'm relying on the ILI vendor, let's have that document, different conversation. But it's all, like I said, it's system dependent, right? So if I run a newer resolution tool, ultra high, with all these fancy algorithms that are being developed and new data transformations, then I have to do that again and understand what the performance of that system is. And maybe the picture looks a little bit better is a potential outcome.
That's possible, but there's physics involved here too.
Oh my gosh!
Part of the trouble is
it's starting to go like the Bruce Nesselroth podcast.
That's exactly what it is, and Bruce and I are good friends. The physics of the problem is that there's only so much you can get out of an MFL type system.
Yeah.
Okay. You're never going to become plus or minus 1 or 2% or plus or minus 5%. Plus or minus 10% is about as good as you're going to get.
Yeah.
Maybe plus or minus 8 or 9.
I think what I was getting,
never.
Yeah,
much
I think
less
what I was
than
getting to, Tom, and I sorry to cut you off, was more that while maybe the data sets that we looked at over, call it 10 years,
yes,
paint one picture, it's possible. Like even in Sherry's presentation, right? She was like, but if I look at data only over the last so many years with only the top quarter of ILI vendors, the performance went up and it was actually more attractive. So what I'm saying is, it's one of the messages I think we're trying to communicate is this is a good lessons learned.
Right.
Let's be diligent about what we're doing moving forward, because the ILI systems are improving, but we can learn about what we need to start looking
Sherry's
out
presentation didn't show that either. Just for the record, it didn't. In fact, she showed a flat line performance. So you're right.
Well,
she did argue that in the one quarter,
Yes.
potentially it got better. But so let me ask that question, Tom. Is this the last study we're going to see on this? It feels like you have to do more work on this now, because all you've done is tell us that we have 50%. I mean, are we going to do things like start slicing and dicing by newer inspections? Are we going to broaden it? I mean,
all of that's useful information. I think, all of those things make sense. And I think it is valuable to take a look at how technology is evolving and improving. Some of the studies we've done shows, there's a little bit of a slope, that the improvements are taking place, but they're not taking place at a rapid rate. This is a pretty mature technology.
I could not agree more. I absolutely agree. So I guess what I was asking is this are you going to do an IPC follow-up on this? Do we get an expanded data set, you think? Or have you turned this rock over, found the problem, and put it back down?
Put it back down. That's right.
Put the rock
No.
back down.
What I'd like to do is
You found a snake.
You open Pandora's box, Tom.
Yeah.
You let it out. Pandora's out running.
It's one of those things. We've experienced this before. We touch a sensitive topic, and then all of a sudden somebody approaches you and snaps. It's like you probably turned over a rock. There was a snake, and you're like, "Oh crap! Put it back down. We don't want the guys coming after us."
I think what we need to do, and maybe what we can do, and I'm looking in a crystal ball in the future, is get more data, get a broader range of ILIs and dig programs, and not just for those that happen to be sent to my company to look at, but let's get some from the day-to-day operations and run similar sort of analyses.
Man, if only PHMSA would have had an initiative to do a voluntary information system.
Gee whiz.
Man, too bad that never took off. Wait, do we have one of those? Anyways, let's move on.
Y'all went right past. Right, I'm aware of that, and even I was like slightly slow on that. So I get one more attack. Any chance that pipeline age played a role here? Was there any bias towards vintage of the pipeline, newer or older, do you think, in this data set?
Good question. I think in general, we believe that pipeline age itself doesn't necessarily have an impact on overall integrity, but corrosion is an ongoing process. So corrosion does tend to make systems more likely to have complicated corrosion as they get deeper and deeper, as they get older and older. And I think from that perspective, I guess older systems might be a little bit tougher to inspect because they have a little bit worse corrosion on them, or more complex corrosion.
So I want to...
Wait, what about diameter?
Okay.
Because Sherry brought that up, that larger diameter, they saw better performance. Any bias towards diameter in this study?
I don't know. We didn't look at it. But diameter does have an impact on ILIs. Smaller diameters are just tougher to get things to work.
That was the point that she brought in her presentation as well. All right, go
No
for your
worries.
question.
So often when people think 1163, we think about statistics.
Right.
And coming from an ILI vendor, one of the things we always either dreaded or enjoyed was, did we reach 80% certainty or 8 out of 10 within the tolerance band of, let's just use plus or minus 10%.
Yep.
Is that enough statistics? Can I just look at that? Can I just say, hey, I'm at 80% certainty on these features, so I'm good to go, I'm done? Or do you think I maybe need to look at something else?
Well, I know you work for an inline inspection company. And one of the things
worked past tense, worked, ED.
Inline inspection companies understand that just because you get maybe 6 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 that meet spec doesn't mean that your inspection didn't meet spec. And they're good at that. Basically, though, what's been put into 1163 are some good statistical tools to evaluate, if I get 6 out of 10, what's the chances that I really did meet my spec? If I get 7 out of 10, is that good enough? If I get 10 out of 10, does that guarantee that I've met the spec?
Yeah.
And that's what statistics is used for.
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that up, right? Because that's where we start using certain terminologies like confidence, right?
Right.
And we shouldn't we shouldn't confuse certainty
And confidence.
with confidence. Those are two different things. So if PHMSA per chance says, hey, the system has to achieve at least a 90% confidence, that's not the whole story, right?
No, that's not.
Yeah, we need to have certainty and confidence. Would you
We
agree?
need to have certainty and confidence. And it's a confusing topic for a lot of people. Certainty means if I were to select 10 locations and I took measurements on 10 locations, how many of them are going to be within spec? And we expect 8 out of 10.
80%, roughly.
80%.
Yeah.
Confidence has to do with if I were to repeat that experiment over and over again. Select a different 10 locations. Dig them up, measure them. Let's say I get 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. How many times on repeating this over and over again will I meet my 8 out of 10 criteria? Well, that's not a statistical definition. That's
But
how I
it gives
understand
us a
it.
practical way to begin to understand
Begin
certainty
to understand
versus confidence. So I
confidence.
want to have, at least in this case, a 90% confidence
Mhm.
that I can achieve an 80% certainty.
Yep.
There you go, guys.
So, Tom, I want to say this has been a pleasure talking to you. You and Mike Rosenfeld are two guests that I feel were long overdue. It's been great having both of you on. And if this podcast goes out of order, I don't know which of you is going first. Now I might have set how it goes. But I want to give you the chance, based on this study, kind of give you the floor. What message do you want to leave with operators or the audience on this study moving
Or
forward?
anyone who's
Or
listening to
anything.
this
Actually,
podcast.
you know what? This is your moment.
Okay, I can say
Words of
anything
wisdom
I
from
want.
Tom. You
Yeah.
actually can.
I could say
We can
anything I
also
want.
edit it.
You can edit it out. That's right. And okay, did we bring us back?
No, go ahead. What would you like?
Well, my main advice to the pipeline companies is to be prepared. This is coming down the pipe. We're going to see it eventually in the regulations. And regulations are going to require our call for pipeline companies to validate that their inspections, in fact, work. And so something like this is going to come down. Whether it's API 1163 third edition or anything else, something's going to happen. So be prepared. Be prepared to use tolerances other than what you're given by the inspection company. Inspection companies are good at what they do, but the real world is not always as generous as they would like us to believe. And for that reason, sometimes the tolerance isn't plus or minus 10%. Sometimes it is plus or minus 15%. And be prepared to address that sort of issue on your pipeline system when you find you have an inspection results.
Tom, thanks for joining us. Really
I appreciate
appreciate it. To our audience, I think you now know why so many of you wanted to hear from Tom on our podcast. Certainly an honor to have him. To the people walking by filming him, they offered, we did not text them and tell them to do that. Totally unsolicited photographs. But thank you for joining this episode, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.